Hi everyone. Glad to be here at least virtually. Appreciate the flexibility. I'm Sage. I'm a grad student at Tufts University, and for the past 4 years or so, I've been investigating some pieces of this really knotty conservation mystery that a lot of you are probably familiar with at this point. So I'll be talking about some of those pieces today, and we can investigate more together. Um, the scene we start with is one that a lot of you probably know at this point. There was that big paper that came out of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology in 2019, finding the decline of the total number of individuals of breeding birds in North America by about 3 billion in the past 50 years. And what was particularly alarming about that was that those declines occurred across migratory and functional and habitat guilds and essentially all across the continent. So it seemed like there were very few groups of birds that were unaffected by this decline. And this is a pretty huge case to think about, and one that's kind of daunting when we're looking at this continental scale. So a good place to start is using data sources that we already have. And this includes a lot of data that folks in the room today have probably collected through community science efforts like eBird or Christmas bird counts. And in particular, we can use that type of data to figure out what the most important areas are for birds right now and determine what makes them the most important. So we know what birds are vulnerable to and what might be causing them to disappear. And you could conceivably do this for any of these important bird areas on the continent. But since we're all in New England, I'll focus here today. And this is actually, as you can see from the map here, an area of tons of continental and global significance for bird populations. I do most of my work in this big red blob in the northwest corner of Maine, in the Maine Northwoods. So I'll talk about that for today. And the Northwoods are a really unique landscape. There are 10 million acres of almost entirely private commercial forest land, and together make up the largest unpaved wilderness east of the Mississippi River. So understanding bird populations here might tell us a lot about what's going on in the region as a whole. But we have a major problem right at the top, which is that the Maine Northwoods are super remote, and so access to them is really challenging. The first roads here were built only in the 1970s by logging companies after the end of river-based log drives. And you can see that even in that early stage, they were in pretty bad shape most of the time. And as we know from our research, this is essentially still the case in the Northwoods. So the consequence for bird conservation is that consistent bird data from this region are very limited. So for the most part, trends in this part of the continent are often inferred from declines in other areas in the region. So a major part of the work that I've done as a graduate student is starting to gather more of that data from the Northwoods in an effort to better understand how bird populations are doing in this essentially unknown region, how they respond to human changes in the landscape, and then how the Northwoods fit into this broader picture of continental bird declines and conservation. So, in trying to unravel some of these reasons behind bird declines, there's a whole bunch of potential suspects. I've shown some of the major ones here, especially for those species that might be migrating between wintering grounds in the tropics and breeding grounds in the temperate zone where we are. But there's plenty of others that you could add to this list. And even if you're starting from just these four, this is a lot more than a single investigator could be tackling. So for today, I'm going to focus mostly on this first component here, and specifically thinking about habitat loss in the context of commercial forestry, since that's the predominant land use on the landscape that I study. Fortunately, it's pretty easy to find information since commercial forestry already has quite the rap sheet in conservation circles. And in particular, it's been the subject of recent alarm bells across the temperate and boreal zones for its role in lost carbon stocks or reduced biodiversity, lost ecosystem services, among other processes. And if we're thinking about birds specifically, commercial forestry has been linked to habitat loss and degradation on the breeding grounds. So, for example, from this study from Betts et al. In the Canadian Maritimes, they found widespread degradation of breeding habitat across that region, especially for species that use mature forest. So looking at this image here, we have a map of golden crowned kinglet habitat, and everywhere in pink is an area they calculated as habitat lost over the past 30 years. So anyone who's played Clue will know that for each suspect you also need a reasonable murder weapon. So in other words, for our purposes, once we've identified a potential driver of bird declines, we also need an understanding of the mechanism by which it might be working. So we can think about that with some of the major ones for commercial forestry. The first of these would be direct habitat loss, or the conversion of one habitat type into another that a particular community can't use anymore. So for example, that might look like shorter harvest rotations that never let forest grow back to a mature age class. We also have the process of fragmentation, or the separation in space of suitable habitat patches without connections in between. And then you can also have degradation or a loss of quality in the habitat. So in particular, in areas like the Maritimes, the use of plantations after harvest has been critiqued as a source of degradation because of how much this simplifies forest structure. So in our area in northern Maine, we expected a lot of those same processes to be occurring, and thus bird populations to be similarly threatened, in particular because a majority of the landscape is commercial forest. So you can see everywhere in gray on this map is private commercial timberland. And over the past century, much of it has been logged pretty intensively. This image here is showing the largest clear cut in Maine's history, the Great Ragmuff clear cut, done in the 1980s and 90s in part of our study area. But to figure out if commercial forestry was causing bird declines in this landscape, we had to gather data on bird populations over time in each of the different forest types that forestry produces, from those really young clear cuts to older, uncut, mature forest. So on this map here, I'm showing the locations of the survey points we used, the 1990s study in yellow and the 2020s in red. And the important thing to point out is that we're using the same exact survey region and the same methods in both studies so that we can directly compare them without confounding variables. And so briefly, those methods come in kind of three stages. We use timber company stand maps to figure out where different forest types are distributed on the landscape. We then set up points in each of those forest types and use point counts or counts during the breeding season of singing birds to estimate the breeding populations of each of the species we're interested in each of those forest types. And then we follow those up with surveys of the structure and composition of vegetation at the site so we can have an idea of the features of habitat that birds might be responding to. So when we take all of those together, they give us an idea of change over time in the amounts of habitat, the populations of birds within them, and then the types of habitats that birds are using at large and small scales. And there's obviously way more detail in this data than I can go into today, so I'll highlight some of our major findings. The biggest of which was our most unexpected, which was that of the core 47 species in this bird community, more than half of them significantly increased in abundance, and another quarter did not change since 1990. Only 8 of these species significantly decreased in that time. This is wild. It was not what we were expecting. And it's especially when you consider our results in the broader context that we established earlier, that a majority of species in this region are declining. So you can see in this plot here, we have the annual population trend derived from breeding bird survey data on the x-axis, and then the abundance change within our landscape on the y-axis. So if you tried to predict what the abundance trend would have been for species in our area based on this broader regional data, you would have gotten fewer than half of those predictions right. So this quadrant right here in purple is showing species that declined in the region based on breeding bird survey data, but either increased or stayed stable within the Northwoods. So clearly something unique is happening in Maine commercial forest that's allowing this different trend to happen, and we'll explore some of those possibilities. Another surprising finding is that many of the species we expected to be mature forest specialists based on their habitat selection in other areas of the region, we're using a much wider range of habitats here. So there's a lot going on in these plots, so I'll direct your attention to the important pieces. We have the different habitat types we surveyed on the x-axis here, roughly increasing in age as you go left to right. And then the bars are showing the average density of each of those species, or the number within a certain area at a point. So 2020s in purple and 1990s in gray. And then those dark purple areas are anywhere where those two bars overlap. So the first thing I notice here is that if these were truly acting as mature forest specialists, we would be seeing only high bars on the right-hand side of these graphs and essentially no use of any of the other habitats. And it's pretty plain that that's not the case for any of these species. Our closest example to a mature forest specialist would be the Blackburnian warbler, which you can see has high bars in those two oldest successional forest classes, but is also using forest in a range of ages down to earlier regeneration. So to sum up thus far, we saw far more positive population trends than in nearby regions, and a bunch of these sensitive declining species that are only in mature forest in other places were far more flexible in northern Maine. So we need to know what's going on. The short answer thus far is that we don't know yet for sure, but there's some interesting possibilities that we can mull over today, and I'll be intrigued to hear other ideas that folks in the audience might have. The first of these possibilities is changes in forest management. So we know that there's been a massive shift in ownership from long-term paper mills to shorter-term investors since the 1990s. And early on, this meant a lot more clear cuts, but also less emphasis on those longer horizon intensive treatments like plantations, which have a really high upfront investment, but a much longer wait for return. So it's not something that would be feasible for short-term investors to do. So in the intervening time, many of the clear cuts from the early 1990s have since grown back on their own into super dense 40-foot tall mid-age forests, like happened to the Great Ragmuff clear cut. Additionally, forest is also cut very differently today. So public pressure in the 1990s against clear cutting led to this near complete shift towards partial cutting, which you can see happening on this plot here with the decline in clear cuts and the increase in these two partial cut strategies. And importantly, partial cutting creates these kind of parallel herringbone structures that you can see from above. And this makes for a much more variable set of young forests recovering from harvests, since they might be harvested multiple times over several decades instead of all at once. And that suggests what I think might be the most important difference between Maine commercial forest and others in the region, which is how they regrow. So if we look back at this image from the Betts et al. Paper, it's showing us that planting after harvest reduces a lot of the complexity of structure and composition that you might find in an older forest. And the same thing plays out on our landscape in a plantation where you can see the wide spacing between trees and the relative lack of an understory, which doesn't leave a lot of space for bird communities to settle. In contrast, these are all the result of untreated regeneration that occurred on our landscape. So you can see super dense hard and softwood regeneration in these two recent clear cuts here, some development of different structure from this regenerating strip cut and the second figure from the right. And then the rightmost figure, we can see the much more developed and diverse understory in a forest that's the same age as the plantation that we saw above. So another mechanism that we're thinking about for increases in Maine in species that were declining elsewhere is that it's possible some species that breed in the Maritimes may pass through Maine on migration and then choose to settle there in future breeding seasons because of better habitat they're finding. Forestry can also have knock-on effects on the food that birds eat. In particular, insects are a huge part of the summer diet and nestling food for a lot of the breeding bird assemblage that we look at, especially butterfly and moth larvae. And so these authors found that butterfly and moth communities in the Northeast were less strongly affected by partial cutting than they were by clear cutting. So there's a possibility that the shifts that we saw in the Northwoods towards partial cutting might have made the landscape more amenable to the bird community's main food source. And there's an additional piece here that the Northwoods are also an international dark sky area that you can see from the box on this figure of Maine at night. So it's possible that threats like artificial light at night and pesticides, which are two huge insect threats elsewhere might be considerably reduced in this landscape, which would also help insect populations. It is important to keep an eye on the species that were declining in our landscape, especially those that may have declined due to commercial forestry. And in particular, our poster child here would be the Blackburnian warbler, which, if we think back to their habitat plot from earlier, we could see they had the strongest associations with tall, old forest. And so in this plot made by one of our technicians using LiDAR data, we can see areas of suitable habitat in red. And the first thing that jumps out to me in this image from our study landscape is that a lot of the commercial forest in this image is almost entirely unsuitable for Blackburnian warblers and is only becoming more so as more old forest is harvested. So if we could identify and work to conserve blocks of old forest within that landscape, this would be a great way to keep this species around. Additionally, four of our decreasing species are near the southern limits of their global range in Maine. So we have bay-breasted warbler, Lincoln sparrow, boreal chickadee, and Canada jay. And we saw all of these dropping in density across their preferred habitats from the 1990s, which suggests to me that we might already be seeing their retreat from New England as breeding birds. And finally, it's important to remember that most birds are better birders than we are, in that they know everyone else who's around, and they have these complex interactions between each other that might inform what habitat they're using. And so this could be a component of broader population trends in different areas as communities change. So in my most recent work, I've been looking at this within a subset of the so-called MacArthur's warblers, which became famous in the 1960s for how well they divided space evenly when they were foraging. But there's been some subsequent evidence that under certain conditions, this division might break down, specifically through bay-breasted warblers acting aggressively towards Blackburnians and black-throated greens and chasing them out of preferred habitat. So I wanted to test if and how that was happening. So this past summer, I was using playbacks of each of those three warbler species towards bay-breasted warblers to figure out what their relative responses would be and thus get a baseline for how those interactions might change under different conditions. And briefly, the result was equally unexpected as before. Bay-breasted warblers were aggressive towards Blackburnians, but they were equally scared of black-throated greensongs and would retreat away from them, the opposite of what we thought. And we also saw some territorial responses from Cape Mays and magnolias and redstarts within the assemblage. So the bottom line thus far is that partitioning and competition amongst this group are likely far more socially complicated than we first thought. So this will make parsing out their effects on habitat choice that much harder. So to wrap up, the case is far from solved, but we have some encouraging signs that, at least in this biologically significant landscape, the usual suspect of habitat loss doesn't appear to be a major factor driving declines for most species. And in fact, this might be one of the most important reservoirs of bird habitat in the Northeast, helping to stem those declines. So keeping track of climate change and the continuing evolution of forestry is going to be important in the coming century. So for my remaining time as a grad student and in my career beyond, I want to be modeling predictions about bird population responses to that kind of change, and also look for examples of other mixed ownership landscapes that have really high value to bird populations to see what broader lessons we can draw from the Northwoods around bird conservation. So that's where I'll leave us today. Just brief thanks to everybody who worked on the field crew, our awesome team of PIs who ran both studies, all of our funders, and the folks who helped us out along the way navigating the landscape. And happy to take questions.